Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling tales in American history. Before we dive in, it's important to note that this video is a work of fiction drawn from folklore and imagination. Characters and events have been adapted creatively, and any similarity to actual people is purely coincidental. We do not condone or depict any dangerous actions. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Has anyone here ever set foot in the Appalachian Mountains? Because what we are about to uncover took place there back when civilization had barely begun to reach the fog-laden slopes of those ancient ranges. The Appalachian Mountains have long been shrouded in an air of seclusion, endless ridges cloaked in dense woodland, valleys so deep that sunlight seldom touched the forest floor, and communities so spread out that weeks could pass without neighbors seeing each other. It was the year 1903, and while the new century promised progress, there were still pockets of the country where time seemed frozen, trapped in a bygone age. In western Virginia, near the border of Kentucky, lay a region locals referred to as the Forgotten Valleys. It was not a formal name found on maps of the era, yet everyone familiar with those mountains knew exactly what it meant. These valleys were so remote that even mail carriers avoided their trails. Families living there relied on themselves for everything, from food to justice. Lucinda Harwell was one of those residents. She was not native to the mountains. Surviving records in the dusty county archives suggest she came from somewhere to the east, possibly the Carolinas or coastal Virginia, though no one could say for sure. What is certain is that she arrived in the mountains as an outsider, and strangers in Appalachia were seldom welcomed. Her cabin sat at the southern tip of a narrow valley, surrounded by ancient oaks and firs. It was a humble log and mud structure, with a single chimney that released wisps of smoke during the cold months. Beyond the cabin, there was nothing but the constant hush of the forest. The nearest trail was almost an hour's walk away, and the closest settlement, a small cluster of homes called Hollow Creek, lay over 10 kilometers distant. Lucinda lived alone, which fueled the local gossip. Solitary women in these isolated places often drew suspicion, and sometimes fear. Rumors spread, as they always did. Some whispered that she spoke to the forest, that she possessed knowledge of herbs and roots capable of curing ailments deemed impossible. Others murmured that her practices were more arcane, mysterious rituals brought from distant lands, secrets handed down through generations of women who understood nature's hidden ways. Yet Lucinda rarely ventured into Hollow Creek. When she did, it was only to trade her medicinal herbs for flour, salt, or kerosene. She spoke little, kept her gaze downcast, and returned to her valley before dusk. Villagers watched her, with a mix of suspicion and caution, perhaps respecting her, or perhaps wary of what they did not understand. Then, in the fall of 1903, something began to shift. Hollow Creek residents noticed that Lucinda had not been seen for weeks. Normally, this would not have raised concern, especially with the onset of colder weather, but an uneasy tension settled over the village. Hunters traveling near her valley reported strange nocturnal lights, bluish glimmers, that danced mysteriously among the trees. Others claimed to hear haunting melodies, female voices singing tunes unknown to church or folk tradition. The first person to voice real alarm was a farmer named Elias Piton, whose land bordered Lucinda's valley. One morning, he discovered 3 of his sheep dead near the creek dividing his property. The animals were untouched by predators, yet their eyes were wide, frozen in an expression of terror. Elias shared his discovery at the Hollow Creek store, and the news began to ripple through the community. Margaret Foss, one of the few women who occasionally visited Lucinda to purchase herbs, decided to investigate. Margaret was a respected figure in the village, a widowed mother of 4 who was unafraid of the mountain paths. She left her home on a crisp October morning, promising to return before nightfall. She did not come back. The following day, her eldest son, Thomas, set out to find her. He followed familiar trails that he had known since childhood, but when he reached Lucinda's cabin, the sight before him made him recoil. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, everything appeared untouched, yet an oppressive silence hung over the space. Near the unlit fireplace, on the packed earth floor, was a single muddy footprint that did not belong to either woman. Thomas raced back to Hollow Creek and rallied a group of men. They ascended the valley together, armed with lanterns and ropes, bracing for the worst. What they discovered at the cabin was more disturbing than they could have imagined. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, yet both Lucinda and Margaret had vanished. What remained was a single unexpected clue, a notebook. It lay open on the rustic table, filled with tightly written, slanted script. The words were in English, but interwoven with symbols and codes that no one could fully decipher. The portions they could read were chilling enough. The notebook contained observations about the forest, notes on moon cycles, plants that appeared only at certain times, intricate drawings of routes, and crude maps of hidden trails. Names were listed in columns, some crossed out, some circled. Margaret Foss's name appeared, underlined 3 times. The men carried the notebook back to Hollow Creek, spending days trying to make sense of it. Sheriff William Thatcher, from Parksville nearly 30 kilometers away, was called to investigate. He examined the notebook, questioned the villagers, and organized extensive searches of the surrounding valleys. The search continued for 2 weeks. Groups combed every trail, every clearing, every stream cutting through the mountains. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no indication of where the women might have gone. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. During this unsettling period, strange occurrences began in Hollow Creek. Villagers reported vivid, disturbing dreams, visions of wandering through the forest at night, and encountered hooded figures arranged in a circle, their voices rising in languages no one recognized. Others dreamt of Lucinda standing alone in a clearing, staring unblinkingly at them, her lips moving in silent words. Ruth Cassidy, one of the villagers, awoke screaming in the dead of night, insisting she had seen Margaret Foss standing at the side of her bed. According to Ruth, Margaret was drenched, as if she had just emerged from a river, and repeated over and over a single phrase, "She showed us the way." When Ruth lit her lamp, the room was empty, but the floorboards beside her bed were damp. Fear settled heavily over Hollow Creek. Families bolted doors and windows as darkness fell. No one dared venture alone into the valleys. The warehouse, once the heart of the village's social life, now received only hurried, silent visits. Conversations were whispered, eyes constantly scanning the shadows, as if some unseen presence might be listening. It was in this atmosphere of tension that a stranger arrived. On a dreary November afternoon in 1903, a man rode into Hollow Creek on a dark horse, carrying a worn leather suitcase. He introduced himself as Samuel Harding, claiming to be a researcher of mountain folklore, traveling the Appalachians to collect old stories, forgotten legends, and accounts of unexplained events. Samuel had learned of the disappearances from a small news item in a Parksville newspaper. Though only a brief paragraph in a corner of the page, it had piqued his curiosity. He took lodging at Hollow Creek's only boarding house, a modest home run by an elderly woman named Abigail Porter, and began asking careful questions. The villagers were hesitant at first. They did not welcome strangers meddling in matters already steeped in unease, yet Samuel's calm, persuasive manner gradually won them over. He judged nothing and listened attentively, encouraging them to share what they knew, what they suspected, and what they feared. Through these conversations, Samuel uncovered a vital detail. Lucinda Harwell was not the first woman to dwell alone in that valley. In the 1,870 seconds, decades earlier, another woman named Constance Vale had lived in the exact same location. Elders recalled that she too had engaged in mysterious practices. Constance vanished one harsh winter, leaving her cabin abandoned for years until Lucinda appeared to claim it. Records hinted at yet another solitary woman before Constance, and before her, another suggesting either a strange pattern or something about the valley itself that demanded a female presence to maintain balance. Samuel devoted long hours to studying Lucinda's notebook. Some symbols he recognized as ancient European markings, brought to America by settlers from remote parts of Scotland and Ireland. Yet other symbols were unfamiliar, a hybrid of various traditions, seemingly developed uniquely within those secluded mountains. One night, by candlelight in his boarding house room, Samuel noticed something remarkable. Holding certain pages to the lamp, faint watermarks emerged, maps, detailing sections of the valley with one location repeatedly marked. a rock formation known to locals as Crow's Rock. The following morning, Samuel declared his intent to visit Raven Rock. No one dared accompany him. The formation had a notorious reputation. Locals spoke of immense flocks of ravens gathering there, blackening the sky, and of people returning from the rocks changed, haunted by visions and whispers. At dawn, Samuel set off alone, carrying provisions for 2 days, a compass, paper and pencil, and Lucinda's notebook safely tucked in his bag. The path was perilous, winding through ancient trees whose branches formed a thick canopy, dimming even midday light. By late afternoon, Samuel arrived at Raven Rock. The formation was imposing 3 enormous stones, stacked in an almost impossible arrangement, forming a natural arch. Silence pressed down. There was no wind, no birdsong, not even the distant rush of a stream, only an oppressive stillness. He noticed symbols carved into the rocks, eroded by time, yet unmistakably the same as those in Lucinda's notebook. They formed a circular pattern around the base, marking a space that seemed sacred, forbidden. At the center, a narrow crack descended into darkness. Samuel shone his flashlight into it. The air was cold and carried an earthy, ancient scent, tinged with something indefinable, primitive, as though it had existed before humans first walked these mountains. The opening was too narrow to enter safely alone, and Samuel hesitated. He decided to camp beside the formation that night and return to Hollow Creek at dawn to seek assistance. He pitched a small tent and lit a fire with dry branches scattered on the ground. Nightfall in the Appalachian Mountains carried a peculiar weight, not merely the absence of light, but a sense that the forest itself was observing. Samuel reviewed his notes, comparing the symbols in Lucinda's notebook to those carved in stone. They matched perfectly, raising even more questions. How long had the marks been there? Who had made them? And why had Lucinda known them? Around midnight, a sound reached him. Faint at first, it grew a chant of intertwined female voices, rising and falling in an irregular, haunting melody. Lantern in hand, Samuel stepped outside. The forest remained still, yet the chanting persisted, emanating from somewhere below, perhaps from the dark crack in the rock itself. Samuel was no believer in superstition. He had spent years investigating phenomena, others called supernatural, always uncovering rational explanations. But there, alone in the Appalachian wilderness of 1903, with the forest around him pressing in, with chants echoing from the darkness below. As the haunting chant faded into the darkness, Samuel felt something he rarely experienced, a genuine uncertainty about what was real and what was illusion. The voices stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was heavier, almost suffocating. He returned to his tent, but found sleep impossible. He lay awake, listening to every whisper of the forest, the crack of a branch, the subtle movement of something unseen just beyond the glow of his campfire. When the first light of dawn touched the treetops, Samuel packed his gear and began the descent back toward Hollow Creek. But the forest seemed altered. Trees, he was certain he had passed, were now subtly shifted. Marks he had etched into trunks to guide his return were gone, vanished, as if the woods themselves had rearranged overnight. Trusting only his compass and the sun's angle, he pressed on. After hours of walking, smoke finally appeared through the trees Hollow Creek. Yet the scene that greeted him was unexpected. Villagers had gathered outside the store, speaking in raised voices, while unfamiliar horses were tied to the posts. Samuel soon learned why. Another person had vanished during his absence. Jacob Turner, a young hunter, had gone into the woods and never returned. His wife, Caroline, wept as other women comforted her. Deputy Thatcher arrived soon after, accompanied by 2 Parksville deputies. Recognizing Samuel, he pulled him aside to speak privately. Thatcher wanted to know what Samuel had discovered at Raven Rock. Samuel recounted the opening in the stones, the carved symbols, and the strange nocturnal chant. Thatcher listened, his expression growing darker with each detail. Then the sheriff revealed something he had withheld from the villagers. In the county archives in Parksville, he had uncovered records of similar disappearances stretching back decades. Rare occurrences, perhaps 1 or 2 every 10 years, but all following the same pattern. Full-time vanishings near that very valley, with the people simply gone, leaving no trace behind. Even more unsettling was a document from 1000 1847, written by a Methodist missionary who had visited the region. The account described a secluded community practicing rituals contrary to Christian teachings. According to the missionary, the mountains demanded periodic offerings to maintain balance, and certain wise women were chosen to mediate between humans and whatever dwelled in the deep earth. Determined to uncover the truth, Samuel and Thatcher organized a larger expedition to Raven Rock. They gathered 7 men, all armed and equipped with ropes, lanterns, and provisions. The following day, under a heavy, overcast sky threatening rain, the group set off. The climb was tense and quiet. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, wondering what horrors or revelations awaited them. When they finally reached the rock formation, they paused to take in the impossible arrangement of stacked stones. Thatcher was the first to approach the crevice. They secured ropes to nearby trees and set up a descent system. Peter Hale, an experienced miner, volunteered to go down first. Skilled in exploring caves and tunnels, he seemed unfazed by the darkness awaiting below. Slowly, he descended, flashlight casting trembling shadows on the rock walls. Those above held the rope taut, alert for any sign of danger. The descent was deeper than expected. 3 meters, 5 meters, 8 meters. Finally, the rope slackened, indicating Peter had reached the bottom. His voice called up, muffled by distance, "There's a chamber here. It's huge. Really, huge." One by one, the men followed, Samuel among the last, with Thatcher behind him. When Samuel's feet touched the rocky floor and he raised his lantern, he was struck silent. They had entered a natural cave, yet it was unlike any ordinary cavern. The walls were adorned with ancient paintings, pigments still vibrant despite humidity and age. Human figures were depicted in circles, hands raised to the sky. Many of the central figures appeared to be women, but not fully human. The cave floor was arranged with objects in circular patterns: polished stones, small animal bones, clay pots filled with what might have been herbs or ashes. At the center lay the remnants of a fire, long extinguished, its ashes forming a perfect mound. Beyond the fire lay a narrow passage, forcing the men to stoop. The walls were damp, moss glistening faintly in the lantern light. The air was heavy and moist, making each breath laborious. Peter Hale led the way, his experience in mines making him best suited for the confined space. After about 50 meters, the passage opened into a smaller chamber. The walls were smooth, polished by countless human hands, with niches carved into the rock. Each contained carefully arranged objects. Samuel examined one, a ragged doll, a wooden comb with strands of hair, a tiny broken mirror, and a miniature Bible no larger than a palm. Each niche seemed to represent a single life, a story preserved in this secret mountain chamber. Thatcher counted the niches, 23 in total. 23 lives, vanished into the valley's mystery over the years. A chill ran down Samuel's spine. Had each niche represented someone who had disappeared? Decades of people swallowed by this ancient enigma. At the far end of the chamber, another passage appeared, even narrower than the last. But this time, one of the men refused to continue. He claimed he felt a malevolent presence, an instinctive warning urging him to turn back. Another man, visibly, trembling, agreed, his fear unmistakable. Thatcher decided that only he, Samuel, and Peter would continue onward. The others were to remain in the chamber, waiting for their return. The 3 men pressed forward. The passage twisted endlessly through solid rock, descending steadily. Samuel tried to judge the depth, but all sense of direction was lost. All he knew was that they were delving ever deeper into the mountain's bowels. At last, the passage opened into a chamber that left the 3 men breathless. It was immense, with a ceiling so high that their lanterns barely illuminated the upper reaches. At the center stood a natural rock formation resembling an altar. Upon it rested more recent items: a wicker basket intact, a woolen shawl Samuel immediately recognized as belonging to one of the Hollow Creek women, and a leather-bound book. With trembling hands, Samuel lifted the book. It was no ordinary text, but a diary. The first page bore a name written in faded ink: Constance. Vale, the woman who had lived in the valley before Lucinda and had vanished in the 1,870 seconds. Flipping through quickly, The lantern revealed pages filled with elegant but uneven handwriting, as if penned in haste or under intense emotion. Constance chronicled visions and dreams of wandering the mountain, guided by something she called the Guardian. She wrote of voices offering counsel, of knowledge surfacing in her mind without explanation. One passage made Samuel pause. "Today I understand my purpose. I am not a prisoner of this place, but its protector. Something sleeps in the depths and must not be disturbed. Those who came before me knew this. Now it is my duty to maintain the balance." Thatcher noted other items scattered about the chamber. Neatly folded clothes, shoes lined against the wall, and offerings, dried fruit, hardened bread, empty ceramic jugs. It was evident someone had been maintaining this place, tending to it with care. Then they heard it, a sound emanating from deeper within, beyond the chamber. It was not the surface chant Samuel had heard, but something different, a steady murmur, like flowing water, yet with an unnatural quality. There was a rhythm, a pulse reminiscent of slow, deliberate breathing. Peter was first to move toward the sound, discovering another passage, so narrow they had to pass sideways. The three exchanged tense glances. They had come so far that turning back without following the sound seemed unthinkable, yet each felt a creeping dread of what they might find. Thatcher made a firm decision. They would advance only as far as the passage allowed, retreating if it became unsafe. Crawling through the tight crevice, their lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls. The passage abruptly opened into a smaller, intimate chamber, revealing something that would forever alter their understanding of the mountain's mysteries. A body sat against the wall, but not as they expected. Naturally mummified by the caves of conditions, the woman's clothing suggested a period from the mid-1800s. Her hands rested on her lap, her face serene. Beside her were four more women, all in similar postures, radiating the same peaceful expression. It was as though they had chosen this place for their final rest, coming willingly to join those who had come before. Samuel knelt by the first figure, observing with growing comprehension. These were the guardians Constance had described in her diary, women who had, over generations, assumed the role of protecting something in the mountains, entering this chamber when their time of service ended. But where were Lucinda and Margaret, and Jacob Turner, the hunter who had recently disappeared? The answer came when Peter noticed another passage, nearly hidden behind the seated figures, a crack in the rock, barely wide enough to pass. Thatcher hesitated, every instinct screaming to turn back, to leave the mountain forever. Yet, as the county marshal responsible for the missing, he could not abandon the search at this crucial moment. Peter volunteered to go first. The passage was so tight, he left his backpack behind, taking only a flashlight. Moments later, his muffled voice called out, "You need to see this." One at a time, Samuel and Thatcher followed. The crevice opened into a chamber of breathtaking beauty. Crystalline formations studded the ceiling, reflecting the lantern light in 1,000 directions, creating an almost celestial glow. At the center lay an underground lake, perfectly still and crystal clear. But it was not the lake that drew Peter's attention. Across the water, partially obscured by stalagmites, sat a figure, Lucinda Harwell, alive. She was cross-legged, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees. She wore the simple garments remembered by Hollow Creek's residents, yet there was an otherworldly stillness about her, a presence suspended between sleep and wakefulness, between this world and another. Thatcher called her. Name. No response. Louder, he called again. Still, silence. Carefully, the three men circled the lake, moving toward her. When Samuel reached her side, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Lucinda's eyes opened immediately. There was no sign of surprise or confusion in them. It was as if she had known they were coming, as though she had been expecting them all along. Her gaze swept over each of the men, penetrating yet not hostile, before she spoke in a voice that sounded distant, almost echoing from far away. "You shouldn't be here." It was not a threat, merely a statement of fact. Thatcher kept his own voice steady as he asked where Margaret Foss was. Lucinda's eyes shifted toward the lake. With a slow, deliberate gesture, she indicated something across the water. There, partially concealed by jagged rock formations, sat another figure, Margaret. She mirrored Lucinda's posture, seated with an expression of serene tranquility. Peter rushed around the lake and reached Margaret's side. He checked her pulse and, to his relief, confirmed she was alive. Her breathing was slow and steady, though she remained unresponsive, no matter how much he called her name or gently shook her. Samuel turned his attention back to Lucinda, desperate for understanding. Calmly, he asked why she was there, why she had brought Margaret, and what this place truly was. For a long moment, she said nothing, choosing her words carefully. Then she began to speak, and her tale was as strange and mysterious as the cave itself. She explained that when she had first arrived in the valley years ago, she was fleeing a life she could not accept, decisions forced upon her by others. She had discovered the abandoned cabin and claimed it as her refuge. But on her first night there, she had a dream. In it, an old woman appeared, showing her the mountain, the hidden chambers, and the secrets preserved for generations. In the days that followed, the dreams continued, growing more vivid. The woman taught her about the unique herbs of the valley, the natural cycles governing the mountains, and the delicate balance that must be maintained. She also spoke of the guardians women who had, through the centuries, chosen to protect something extraordinary. "Protect what?" Samuel asked, his voice soft but insistent. Lucinda gestured toward the lake. "Silence," she replied. "There is something down here that must remain asleep. I cannot say exactly what it is. Those before me didn't know either, but we feel its presence. We sense its weight, and we understand our duty is to watch over it," she continued, explaining that Margaret had come to her cabin, as she often did, seeking medicine. But this time, Margaret was afflicted not physically, but spiritually, weighed down by a sorrow she could not name. Unable to find rest, Lucinda had brought her to this hidden sanctuary. "She is resting," Lucinda said simply. "For the first time in years, she is truly at peace." Thatcher struggled to fully accept the story. Part of him wanted to grab both women and leave immediately. Yet another part, the part that had witnessed too much in this investigation to dismiss it, hesitated. Then they heard it again. That same low, constant murmur Samuel had noticed earlier. But now it was closer, stronger, and unmistakably emanating from the lake itself, as if the water itself was vibrating at a frequency barely perceptible to human ears. Lucinda closed her eyes. "He's waking," she murmured. "You disturbed him by being here. You must leave now." There was no room for argument. Peter lifted Margaret into his arms, careful not to wake her. Her body remained completely relaxed, trusting him entirely. The return through the chambers was tense and hurried. Peter struggled with Margaret's weight, his boots occasionally slipping on the damp stones. Thatcher moved ahead, lanterns swaying, guiding their path through the narrow passages. Samuel followed, and last, constantly glancing back, hoping to see Lucinda behind them, but she remained seated beside the lake, motionless, like the mummified guardians in the previous chamber. The sound grew louder, no longer a distant murmur but a tangible presence that made the very rock beneath their feet seem to vibrate. Lantern flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and small stones rained down from the ceilings. The mountain itself seemed to awaken around them. When they reached the chamber where the other men waited, panic had taken hold. The vibrations and sounds had frightened them. One had already begun climbing the rope back toward the surface without waiting for the others. The ascent was chaotic. Margaret had to be carefully tied to a makeshift harness and hoisted upward, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The men climbed one by one, hands clawing at ropes, feet seeking purchase against the rock. By the time the last of them emerged into the fading sunlight, the faint sky was tinged with orange and red, a stark contrast to the darkness they had left behind. Margaret was laid on a blanket spread across the ground. Slowly, she stirred, blinking as if waking from a deep and restorative sleep. Her gaze focused on the faces around her, confusion mingled with something else, a profound calm. The lines of worry that had once marked her face were softened, replaced by an unexpected serenity. The descent from the mountain back to Hollow Creek was slow. Margaret insisted on walking, despite her weakened legs. Other days of immobility had left Margaret's memory fragmented. She remembered only fleeting glimpses, the shimmer of light dancing on water, sitting in absolute silence while some unseen force soothed her mind. But the details remained hazy, slipping away the moment she tried to focus on them. By the time they reached the village, night had fallen. Word of Margaret's return spread quickly. Her children ran to her, tears streaming down their faces, relief written in every gesture. Women of Hollow Creek crowded around her, offering blankets and hot tea, peppering her with questions she could not fully answer. Yet the celebration was short-lived. There were still missing people. Jacob Turner, the hunter, had not been accounted for, and Lucinda remained deep within the mountains, hidden in her extraordinary cave. That evening, Thatcher and Samuel convened at Abigail Porter's boarding house, attempting to process what they had witnessed and what Lucinda had shared. Thatcher, a man of practical experience, was accustomed to solving crimes with clear motives and tangible evidence. This, however, defied every expectation and challenged the limits of his experience. Samuel, by contrast, had studied similar stories from across the Appalachians, legends of guardians watching over ancient sites, of pacts made between humans and the elemental forces of the land. He had once dismissed such accounts as folklore, symbolic explanations for the unexplainable. Now, he was no longer certain. The following morning, an unexpected figure appeared on the outskirts of Hollow Creek. Jacob Turner arrived, walking slowly along the main trail. He was filthy, exhausted, but unharmed. The villagers rushed to meet him, relief and astonishment in equal measure. Jacob told an unusual tale. During his hunt, he had become lost, twisted his ankle, and taken shelter in a small cave. He survived there for several days on water from a nearby stream and the limited provisions he carried. Most strikingly, each night he had heard voices female, seemingly emanating from the very rock walls, singing in a language unknown to him. In his dreams, an old woman guided him, showing him the correct path home. By morning, his ankle had miraculously improved, and he knew exactly which direction to follow to return. His description of the woman mirrored the mummified figures. Samuel, Thatcher, and Peter had discovered ancient clothing, serene expressions, eyes that seemed to peer into one's soul rather than merely look. In the days that followed, Hollow Creek gradually returned to its rhythm. Margaret resumed her daily routines, tending to her children. Jacob recovered fully and promised never to venture so far into the mountains alone again. Conversations in the village slowly shifted from the mysteries of the cave to mundane concerns, preparing for winter, stocking provisions, and tending to daily chores. Yet Samuel could not let the matter rest. He spent weeks reviewing notes, examining Lucinda's notebook, attempting to decode the symbols etched in stone. He visited Margaret several times, gently inquiring what she recalled of her experiences. Though she could offer few concrete answers, a transformation was evident. The melancholic weight that had haunted her was gone. She slept soundly, awoke refreshed, moved with a newfound lightness, and smiled more freely than she had in years, as if a burden had been lifted. Thatcher eventually returned to Parksville, taking Constance Vale's diary and his own detailed notes. Officially, he closed the case. The disappearances were classified as isolated incidents, likely caused by disorientation in the treacherous mountains. Lucinda Harwell had chosen voluntary seclusion, and no crime had been committed. But Thatcher knew the truth was far deeper than the official report suggested. At night, alone in his office, he often revisited Constance's diary, reading passages that lingered in his mind. There was an unwavering certainty in her words, that he secretly envied a purpose beyond negotiation or uncertainty. Law and order offered no absolutes. Constance had found one. Samuel remained in Hollow Creek until early December 1903. Winter arrived early in the mountains, snow covering trails and rendering the upper valleys nearly inaccessible. He knew he could not return to Raven Rock until spring, and even then, he hesitated, uncertain whether he should. He had seen and learned too much, knowledge perhaps not meant for men like him. Before leaving, Samuel made one last visit to Lucinda's cabin. He did not attempt to reach the caves, only the modest log structure where it all began. The door swung gently in the cold wind. Inside, everything was as it had been. The candle-stained wooden table, the fireplace with old ashes, shelves lined with carefully labeled herb jars. Samuel sat in the lone chair, imagining Lucinda's solitary life, long, quiet winters, nights accompanied only by the whisper of wind through the trees, mornings spent gathering herbs in the forest. There was a terrifying simplicity to her existence, a life devoted entirely to one purpose. His eyes caught something previously unnoticed. On the wall beside the fireplace, faint carvings were etched into the smoke-darkened wood, dozens of names over many years. Samuel traced the letters with his fingers. He recognized some, Constance Vale, and other, older names, likely of women who had served as guardians before her. At the bottom, just below Constance, was a blank space. That was where Lucinda's name would eventually be inscribed, perhaps waiting until the end of her tenure as protector to join the lineage of women who had chosen this extraordinary path. When Samuel finally departed Hollow Creek, he carried notebooks filled with observations, sketches of symbols, and then answers. Over the following years, Samuel Harding traveled to other corners of the Appalachian Mountains, collecting stories that bore remarkable similarities. Patterns emerged, suggesting a hidden network of ancient knowledge that stretched across the range. During his journeys, he heard tales of other solitary women living in remote valleys or near peculiar rock formations. Some were called healers, others labeled witches, depending on the storyteller. Yet they shared common traits: an intimate understanding of the land, a deep awareness of vigilance and balance, and, curiously, when one disappeared, another eventually appeared to take her place. Life in Hollow Creek returned to its slow, measured pace. Seasons shifted with predictable rhythm. Winter melted into spring, and spring into the summer of 1904. Margaret Foss tended to her children, worked her modest plot of land, and occasionally traveled down to the village for supplies. She never spoke of her time in the cave, and villagers eventually stopped asking. An unspoken agreement settled over the community. Some things were best left unexplained. Jacob Turner resumed hunting, always accompanied by others, and carefully sticking to familiar trails. He deliberately avoided the region surrounding Lucinda's valley, making long detours when necessary. Occasionally, Caroline, his wife, would awaken in the middle of the night to find him on the porch, staring into the shadowed mountains as if expecting something. She never pressed him for an explanation, having learned it was better not to. From time to time, travelers and hunters passing near Raven Rock reported seeing strange lights in the mountains, bluish or silvery glimmers that moved unpredictably through the trees. Some dismissed them as moonlight reflecting off quartz veins in the rocks. Others offered no rational explanation, only a certainty that they had witnessed something inexplicable. Throughout the year, Lucinda's cabin remained undisturbed. Winter snow blanketed its roof, spring brought climbing vines, and summer saw birds nesting under the eaves. Slowly, nature reclaimed the cabin, weaving it once more into the forest. Then, one autumn morning in 1904, a year after the disappearances, something shifted. Margaret's eldest son, Daniel, was hunting rabbits in the hills when he noticed smoke rising from Lucinda's valley. It was thin and steady, the kind produced by a carefully tended fire rather than an accident. Alarmed, Daniel ran home to tell his mother. Margaret paused for a long moment, staring toward the distant mountains. Without a word, she gathered a basket filled with fresh bread, honey, and vegetables from her garden. She told her children she would return before sunset, and began the climb toward the valley. Arriving at the cabin, she found the door open and the interior spotless. The fireplace glowed warmly, and at the table, meticulously preparing herbs, sat Lucinda Harwell. The two women regarded one another in silence, a quiet that stretched far beyond the measure of ordinary time. Margaret placed the basket on the table. Lucinda acknowledged it with a subtle nod. No words were necessary. Margaret had descended into the depths, experienced the silence that soothed troubled minds, and now understood what had previously been beyond her comprehension. Over the months that followed, Margaret visited Lucinda regularly, always bringing small offerings of food or cloth. She never lingered just enough to ensure the guardian had what she needed to endure the approaching winter. In turn, Lucinda occasionally visited Margaret's property, delivering medicine to a sick child or providing special roots to enrich the crops. A silent accord existed between Hollow Creek and the valley's solitary woman. She would remain undisturbed, and in return, she would continue her unseen stewardship over something no one truly wished to understand. Life in the mountains was arduous enough without complicating it with mysteries unsolvable by strength or tools alone. Years passed. In 1907, Samuel Harding published his research on Appalachian folklore, carefully omitting specifics about Lucinda or the Raven Rock Caves. He had vowed not to expose those women to inquisitive outsiders who might disrupt the delicate balance they maintained. His book mentioned isolated healers and their botanical knowledge, but revealed nothing of their true role. Thatcher continued serving as deputy in Parksville until his retirement in 1915. He never again pursued mountain disappearances with the intensity he had devoted to Lucinda's case. He had learned that not all mysteries were meant to be solved. Sometimes answers were more disturbing than the questions themselves. On his final day, he burned his personal notes on the caves, watching the smoke rise toward the afternoon sky. Margaret lived until 1928, passing at the age of 62. Her children grew and married. Some remained in Hollow Creek, others sought life in larger towns. She never disclosed the full truth of her experiences, not even to her own family. Yet she maintained a small altar in her room, adorned with candles and wildflowers gathered from the mountains, a ritual that left her descendants both curious and respectfully silent. Lucinda continued her solitary life in the valley for many years. Occasionally, travelers spotted her tending plants on the slopes, always alone, always silent. She aged naturally, hair turning silver, posture stooping slightly under the weight of time, but her eyes retained that penetrating clarity and sense of purpose that Samuel had noticed on their first encounter. By the 1,920 the visits of Hollow Creek residents to Lucinda's cabin ceased, not by deliberate choice, but because a new generation had grown up, unaware of the events of 1903. To them, the solitary woman was simply an eccentric to be avoided. Her story persisted only as local legend, tales whispered to frighten children on stormy nights rather than as living memory. The cabin was finally found empty in 1931. A hunter venturing into the valley for the first time in decades discovered the door ajar, the interior meticulously maintained, yet no sign of Lucinda. The fireplace was cold, the herb shelves bare, and on the table lay a single item, the notebook the men had discovered years before, now filled with additional notes, symbols, and diagrams. The hunter brought it to Hollow Creek, where the few remaining elders recognized her handwriting, though most of its contents were indecipherable. Over decades, Lucinda had developed a language of her own, a system for recording knowledge in secret, leaving behind a legacy meant for no one but herself and the unseen forces she had long watched over. Hours in the quiet, walking the ridges, scattering herbs in patterns she had learned from the notebooks, whispering incantations that were part prayer, part instruction, part memory. Slowly, imperceptibly, the valley seemed to respond. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of her herbs across the slopes. Streams swirled more vividly in the sunlight, and at night, faint glimmers appeared among the stones near Raven Rock, almost as if the mountain itself were acknowledging her presence and her work. By the time the geologists returned for another survey, Sarah had prepared. She did not confront them directly, as she had before, but instead allowed the subtle influence of her rituals to take effect. Instruments misread the soil composition. Survey readings became inconsistent. Drilling rigs failed to start. Compasses spun inexplicably. Minor accidents delayed their operations repeatedly, all without Sarah being present. The men, frustrated and unnerved, began attributing the failures to faulty equipment or the unpredictable terrain. Eventually, after weeks of unproductive work and strange anomalies, the project was quietly abandoned. Sarah knew she had not defeated the geologists in the conventional sense. The mountain itself had done much of the work. She was merely its intermediary, the guardian channeling its will. She returned to her cabin, tending her plants, recording her observations, and maintaining the delicate equilibrium that generations of women before her had preserved. Decades passed, and the world outside continued its relentless change. Automobiles replaced horses, telephones connected distant towns, and cities sprawled ever larger. Yet, within the Lucinda Valley, the rhythm of the mountains endured. Sarah aged gracefully, her hair silvering, her back slightly stooped, but her eyes retaining that same penetrating clarity that had first marked Lucinda, then the women before her. She trained a few apprentices, women who showed the same instinctive recognition of the land and its subtle rhythms. Only they were allowed to participate in the deeper mysteries, the lessons that could not be fully explained, that existed beyond logic. When Sarah finally passed, in the mid-1970 seconds, the notebook she had maintained for decades was carefully placed back on the cabin table. Its pages, thick with handwriting, symbols and diagrams, recorded not only plants and remedies, but the lineage of guardians, the cycles of vigilance, and the quiet interventions that had preserved the balance of the mountains. And so the cycle continued. Another young woman would find her way to the valley, guided by intuition, dreams, or the gentle insistence of the land itself. She would read the notebooks, trace the symbols, and slowly awaken to the knowledge already lying dormant within her. The mountains, silent witnesses to generations of guardians, would continue to keep their secrets. The caves, the streams, the hidden chambers, the crystal-clear waters beneath Raven Rock all remained, waiting for the next who would take up the mantle, ensuring that the fragile balance of the valley endured, unbroken, for all-time interest in conservation and protecting natural landscapes. Sarah saw the irony in this, knowing that the mountains she had devoted her life to guarding were already preserved in ways no government regulation could achieve through the careful vigilance of those who understood the land's deeper truths. By the late 1970 seconds, Sarah's health began to decline. Her steps grew slower, her hands trembled more noticeably, and the quiet ache in her bones reminded her that her time as guardian was nearing its end. Yet she faced it without fear. She had trained Elizabeth well, and the valley had once again chosen its next keeper. One crisp autumn morning in 1978, Sarah quietly passed away in her cabin, surrounded by the tools of her life's work, jars of dried herbs, notebooks filled with knowledge, and the small altars she had maintained for decades. Elizabeth assumed the mantle seamlessly. She maintained the same daily care of the cabin and gardens, regular hikes to Ravenstone, careful attention to the valley and its hidden caves. Like Sarah, she recorded observations, dreams, and subtle phenomena, preserving a lineage of guardianship that stretched back more than a century. Though the world beyond the mountains continued to advance, the valley remained a timeless enclave. Hikers occasionally reported strange lights and unusual sounds, but no one ever penetrated the deeper chambers. Those who were drawn there often left with a quiet peace, a sense of understanding they could not articulate, and through every generation, Constance, Lucinda, Sarah, Elizabeth, the cycle endured. Women chosen by intuition, by quiet recognition, by the mountains themselves, who safeguarded secrets that could neither be explained nor ignored. The story of Ravenstone became legend, whispered around fireplaces and told to children during long winter nights. Yet beneath the folklore, the truth persisted. A living network of guardians watched over the mountains, preserving a balance invisible to ordinary eyes, ensuring that the mountain's ancient presence continued undisturbed, as it always had, and would, as long as there were those willing to heed its quiet call. If you want, I can also craft a final, almost mythical closing paragraph that ties all 4 generations together in one reflective, timeless passage, giving the story a sense of eternity and the enduring mystery of the Appalachian guardians. Do you want me to do that? And so, the cycle continued. From Constance to Lucinda, Sarah to Elizabeth, and now Maya, generations of women had answered a call that transcended time, geography, and the logic of the ordinary world. They preserved the balance, tended the land, and watched over the hidden depths of the Appalachian Mountains, carrying knowledge that was older than any record or law. The mountains remained a sanctuary. Trails came and went, maps were drawn and revised, tourists arrived and left, yet the valley, the caves, and the ancient watch endured. Each generation adapted, finding ways to meet the encroaching modern world while maintaining the delicate equilibrium their predecessors had fought to protect. And perhaps that was the true lesson of Raven Rock, not that mysteries could always be solved, nor that knowledge must always be shared, but that some things were worth guarding quietly, with patience, humility, and reverence. In those hidden corners of the world, life moved according to older rhythms, and there, in the silence and the stillness, the guardians continued their eternal vigil. The story of Ravenstone and its women was not just a tale of courage and secrecy, it was a testament to the enduring bond between humanity and the land, between knowledge and intuition, between the present and the ancient whispers of the world. Somewhere, deep in the mountains, the light shifts through the trees, streams murmur over hidden stones, and a solitary figure moves with purpose, ensuring that the balance remains and that the mountain's secrets stay as they have always been, alive, waiting, and quietly watched.